Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. I hope you are well wherever you are. Welcome to this webinar organized by Land at Scale, the Land Portal, and Norwegian Refugee Council. So before I introduce myself, some logistics note. So we have interpretation into French and Spanish. Please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. For some of you, you might have to click on more first. And I understand it's very important that you each check a language, otherwise you might be hearing multiple languages simultaneously. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. If you have any questions, don't use the chat, but use the Q&A feature. It's at the bottom of your screen as well. And if you wish to address a question to a specific panelist, then make sure that you indicate this clearly. And in the interest of transparency, I should add that today's session is being recorded and live streamed, and there will be a video link made available to you at the end of the webinar. So let me introduce myself. I'm the moderator today. So I'll be introducing the session, then asking the panelists a series of questions about their experiences. And then we'll interact with you, the audience, and take questions from you. I am Marco Langhorst. I work for the International Development Law Organization in Rome. And for those of you who do not know us, IDLO is an intergovernmental organization that promotes people-centered justice and the rule of law to advance sustainable development and peace. And I'm very grateful to the organizers to have been asked to moderate this session. Let me briefly give the floor to Eva to say a few words about the Land at Scale program. Eva, over to you.
Thank you, Marco. And again, a warm welcome to everyone in the call today. I see we're already up to 188 participants, so lovely to have you all here. So welcoming you here for the Land at Scale program. Land at Scale program is a land governance support program financed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and coordinated by the Netherlands Enterprise Agency. And we're very happy to co-host this session together with NRC and with Land Portal today. This is the second webinar in a webinar of 3, which will focus on land and conflict. And we hope in these webinar series to really link this land sector more to the humanitarian sector to bring these two worlds closer together. So do no harm has been a principle which we worked on in the framework of the Land at Scale program for the past years, and we very much look forward to doing that also in the coming years, since some of you might have seen that the Land at Scale program has officially been able to launch its second phase a couple of weeks ago. Do no harm comes forward in different ways, such as adaptive programming, but today the session will dive into very concrete examples of that within the framework of Land at Scale, but also with our colleagues from NRC. And we're very happy to have a very diverse panel here today, which Marco will shortly introduce to you. So thank you, Marco, for being our moderator today already in advance. Marco, we've worked together with you for a very long time, very closely, so more than confident that you'll be able to lead us for a very interesting discussion this day. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva, for the introduction and your kind words. So our webinar, as Eva said, is part of a series of 3 that looks at land and conflict, and this is a topic that that strongly resonates with my own work and that of my my organization. So again, very happy to moderate, even though I'm slightly intimidated by the number of participants that you have managed to gather for this event. So just a few reflections, examples from my own work. So my organization, as I said, mainly works on justice issues and rule of law issues. But the connections between what we do and land are evident almost on a daily basis in the work that we do. So we have Annonciat with us today. She'll be speaking about Burundi. I also worked there some years ago. We were working with civil courts, and over 80% of cases in civil courts in Burundi are land cases, are land conflicts. And this is something we saw in Burundi, as I said, but we see it basically across the board in the countries where we work, especially in rural areas, in places where land is the primary productive factor. Much of disputes are essentially about land. And it's not only in our work in civil law that we see this, but also in our work on criminal justice. So in the Sahel, around 30% of the cases involving violent crime that the courts that we support deal with are cases that deal with, that come from a land conflict that happened before. And basically around the world where we do our work, we see, as I'm sure many of you do, that tensions over land in one way or another, especially in more fragile and conflict-affected settings, are tied up with broader societal conflict. So very important topic, and something that we also see, and I think that brings us closer to the topic of conversation today on do no harm, is that whenever land governance interventions are being undertaken, whether in the form of land policy reform, strengthening land administrations, formalization of rights, or land consolidation, they often have a bearing on justice. So when such interventions affect rights or decision-making powers, confer legitimacy or take them away, as they almost always do, there is also a justice dimension that needs to be taken account. And so, as Aoife suggested in her brief introduction, we should never just look narrowly within the confines of our own sector or our own way of working, but in essence today is a call to always take a broader outlook on the work that you are doing. So do no harm, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it, but it's a principle that stems from the realization that aid can unintentionally worsen conflict, inequality, or harm despite our good intentions, and that therefore such interventions must be designed and delivered with an acute awareness of these potential side effects. And whilst the concept is often associated with working in more fragile and conflict-affected settings, I think it's very important to highlight that it applies more broadly across development settings, also in stable settings, middle-income countries, where there are, for example, entrenched inequalities, structural discrimination, or legal institutional plurality. It's always important to look at the possible adverse effects of an intervention. And such adverse effects can, of course, be thought of as conflict, but they may also involve other things one wouldn't want to see, such as dispossession, exclusion, marginalization, delegitimization, or accentuation of grievances. So the effects can be many. Now, do no harm and its sister concept, conflict sensitivity, basically they instruct us never to see our work in humanitarian, peace building, or development interventions as being merely technical or neutral. They tell us that such interventions always function within wider systems and will inevitably produce ripple effects by changing power balances and distribution of resources. Now, over to what we'll be doing today. We'll be looking at situations where humanitarian action can produce unintended consequences connected with land. This is what our colleague Jude Halase will be speaking about. Jude is a legal specialist with Norwegian Refugee Council in Bangladesh. Jude, very good to have you with us. We will also be looking at situations where land governance interventions lead to unintended side effects, which is what our colleague Annonciat Twagirayezu will be speaking about. And Annonciat is a program manager with ZOA in Burundi. And we'll be speaking about instances where development programs in other sectors have unanticipated effects on land rights. And our colleague Paul Pretitore will be speaking about how such effects can be prevented and managed. And Paul is a senior land administration specialist at the World Bank. He's based in Croatia, covers the Europe and Central Asia region, and is currently leading a global study on fragility, conflict, and violence. Now, beyond asking the panelists to provide examples, we'll also be asking them how do no harm thinking can effectively be integrated into our ways of working as humanitarian and development organizations at the design stage and at the implementation stages of our work, and also whether we ought to be doing more than just preventing harm. So, over to the panelists. My first question is going to be for Jude. Jude, again, good to have you with us. And I want to ask you, from Norwegian Refugee Council's experience in humanitarian settings like Bangladesh, what are some of the more common ways that land-related harm can unintentionally be created when land is not the primary focus of your intervention? Over to you. Thank you very much, Jude. And can I briefly ask a follow-up question? So what are the ways in which these kind of effects could have been prevented if the due diligence, would have been conducted properly? What kind of conversation could have been had? Yeah, no, thank you. Very good. Let me turn to Annonciat with a similar question. Annonciat, can you provide an example based on ZOA's work on land governance where an intervention unintentionally created risks such as exposure to eviction, exclusion, or conflict, and share with us why those risks were not visible at the design stage? And perhaps you can start with a very short introduction of the nature and location of ZOA's work on land in Burundi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Securing land in Burundi is done in the council, and we systematically certify lands, and we support the government in identifying and demarcating state-owned land. The case that was highlighted as land insecurity was during identification and certification of land owned. I think our speaker is having connection issues. Sorry. So we also have population that are living in protected areas, and some of them are worried, are concerned, because some of the plots where they were living were identified as state-owned lands. So knowing that some of those lands did not belong to them, so there was a land insecurity among those population in the lands that were identified as state-owned land. So now the government had to try and raise the awareness of the community before carrying out any activity in the area. Thank you for your kind attention.
Hi, Annonciat. I'm afraid the line wasn't always that good, at least on my side. So do I understand correctly that you supported land registration, which happened on state land? So there were communities living on state land, and so what was the issue? Was that land then inadvertently registered in the name of the occupants, or what exactly was the harm that occurred in the situation that you're describing? I apologize for not having been able to hear it very well.
Oh, sorry. So the first part, I said that we are working in a council and we support communities to certify their land, but there's a due diligence activity that should be done. That is identifying and demarcating state-owned lands, and it is done by the technical services of the state. During that identification, we noticed that some lands were qualified as state-owned, whereas they were occupied by populations. So the insecurity was that the population was worried that they will be evicted from their lands. So some of these population are living in state-owned lands, and others are living in protected area and reserves. So I don't know if you captured what I wanted to share earlier.
Yes, thank you. And so what was the result of the situation? Did people stay living there, or did the government undertake action, or what ensued?
Now, so we started carrying out some activities with this situation. there was a conflict between the population and the state, and this conflict was marked with letters from population that were feeling victims of this identification of state-owned land. And all these claims were documented case by case, hills by hills, and we have two hills that are particularly affected. And the technical team from the ministry supported with our project, we try and capitalize and document these claims, and they came out with a document to analyze this conflict with a solution that was proposed. And the document was shared with the ministry to come out with a solution, and a long-lasting solution. So the council also carried out some advocacy before the ministry. We had a council meeting so that this situation should not impede on the rights of the population, because we know that some hills that were known as state entities, and the population was known as living in state-owned land. So in that advocacy shared by the council, the project conducted an advocacy work so that people that were living on those hills should have access to certification and to a non-discriminatory systematic certification of their lands. So they are working to identify and certify the lands of the populations that were living there, and the report will be shared, and some solution will be analyzed, because with the meetings that were done with the ministry in charge during the identification phase, we had an interview guide. We were asking the people how long they had been there, and we were asking them whether they had another plot in another council. So they had to share with us the reason why they left the other council to come and live in this new hill. So what we undertake is a mission to try and see case by case who is rightly living in those hills.
Thank you very much, Annonciat, for sharing your experience. In a moment, we can perhaps continue to see how you have learned from these lessons. But let me first turn to Paul. Paul, from a World Bank perspective, how do land-related risks emerge both from land-focused projects and from non-land investments, such as infrastructure or development projects?
Thanks, Marco. The primary way that the World Bank is working, I mean, there's two streams. I mean, there's kind of the knowledge stream, which is the analytical, technical assistance work, and the investment, which is the loans and grants to countries to implement usually sector-specific projects like a land administration project. On the latter, when it comes to bank investments, the risk is usually identified upfront. So there's a lot of work that goes into identifying potential risk. I'll talk more about those tools later, with the idea being that, the risk is identified and dealt with before the project starts, or at least we know how to deal with it via the project. I mean, the type of things that tend to emerge are, contested rights, particularly when you're in conflict or fragility or violent situations, clash of tenure regimes. So, where does the formal and the informal, the customary and the formal overlap and interact? And accessibility of land. We run into a lot of problems where, for example, a government might say, we have this public land that's available for investment. But whether it's really public land is not always clear. The boundaries aren't always demarcated. It might be used informally. So there's often a difference in interpretation and for what the government considers kind of clear title versus what's really clear title on the ground. So, like I said, I mean, most of the risk is dealt with upfront, and mechanisms are put into projects to deal with it. When it comes to analytical work, there's bank tools like the resilience and disaster needs assessments, which are more and more looking at risks related to land, particularly in the conflict or the disaster context. I mean, the downside of this upfront approach is that sometimes more risky investments might get funneled out of the system because of the incentive or the cost of dealing with these risks. So I would say that might be the downside. But most of the risk is dealt with upfront, and you know, there's a way to deal with it through the project. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And so does it happen that risks, unanticipated risk emerge during the project implementation? And how does the bank then deal with those or your partners?
I mean, it depends on the level and the type of risk that emerges or problem that emerges. And yes, absolutely they do. I mean, sometimes it's small scale. I mean, people complaining over boundaries or, you know, the designation of ownership or inheritance via land registration or cadastral reconstruction project. Sometimes it's a disagreement between the state and citizens about what is public land and what is private land. There are different mechanisms. So, you know, if every project has a grievance redress mechanism where people can complain via the project if they feel that the project has caused some type of harm. I mean, there's always recourse to the court system or other accountability institutions in country. And, you know, there's kind of the nuclear option of, you know, we have like the integrity and we have the, now I'm forgetting the inspection panel. So the inspection panel is kind of the nuclear option internally. But this is usually when there's been a huge problem, like for example, around corruption or, you know, involuntary resettlement that was not supposed to happen, but ended up happening and not per the bank's rules.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks also for summarizing the different, let's say, types of underlying problems that we're dealing with when it comes to unintended effects and land rights. And I think what you said, contested rights, clash of tenure regimes, lack of clarity, whether it be about rights or the status of lands, is something that clearly featured also in what Annunciate and Jude have just shared with us. So let me go to the second round of our questions, starting again with Jude. Jude, I'd like to hear about the due diligence approaches that NRC relies on. So in volatile emergency context, how does NRC apply rights-based due diligence around land when formal tenure systems are weak, informal transactions dominate, or land or government policies are unclear? Can you share a concrete example where this prevented evictions or secondary displacement? I mean, applying those techniques. Thank you.
Hi, Marco. So in these situations, we aim to achieve an appropriate level of legal certainty, even when it cannot be really perfect. So for example, we prioritize substantive right to land and property over the existence of formally recognized legal documentation. An example of this would be a verbal agreement between two families that was endorsed by community leaders, because during displacement and highly informal contexts, documentation is often absent and authorities might also not be present. Nevertheless, the families in this situation retain certain rights based on these verbal agreements and the local recognition from the community leaders. So in these cases, there are different methods that we can rely on, such as first is community verification, which can help establish historical land use. So we engage with the community leaders and the neighboring landholders to help confirm boundaries, land use history, etc. We also review available documentation. They might not be the legally recognized documentation by the state, but they can be supporting documents that tell us the story of the land use or the land ownership in this situation. This can include tax receipts, for example, tree planting records for agricultural land, land maps that show the boundaries, etc. We also engage in mediation or negotiation to reach an agreement between the relevant stakeholders whenever there's an issue that arises over land or property. An example of this where we have successfully prevented eviction happened in one of the camps in Cox's Bazar also. I'm telling an example from my recent experience, where some Rohingya families approached NRC for support to prevent eviction. So they had been residing in the same shelters within the camp boundaries since their arrival in 2017 into Bangladesh, and reported that they had received verbal permission from the perceived landowner to stay on these plots. But one day, however, the perceived landowner asked them to vacate the shelters and move somewhere else because he intends to build a house on that plot specifically. Now, the tenure system in Cox's Bazar, in Bangladesh in general, but in Cox's Bazar specifically, is quite complex. So we had to rely on community verification to conduct due diligence. So we met with camp authorities, other land owners in the area, and we talk to other families, other refugee families within the same camp, within the same block, to try and substantiate the verbal agreement that they mentioned they had since their arrival. Also, upon research, we found out that the plot is actually classified as forest land, and under the local legislation or national legislation of Bangladesh, people are not really allowed to build structures on forest land. They can only use it for livelihood purposes. And forest lands were given by the government at the beginning of the crisis to be used within the Rohingya refugee response. So based on all these findings, we engaged with negotiations. We included the camp authorities, but also the landowner, of course, or the use rights holder in this case, because he had use rights to the land rather than ownership rights. And we through the negotiation process, we reached an agreement and we prevented the eviction of the families from the land. Thank you.
Yeah, and a brief follow-up question, if I may, Jude. So, especially in the let's say the earlier stages of your interventions, does your organization have like a I don't like the word that much, but a toolkit of sorts or something? Do you have like a set methodology for analyzing these kind of issues? Because what you're describing now is very, very detailed, case specific. But what policies or approaches do you have within your organization?
You mean to analyze cases like this, like eviction threats and real evictions?
Well, maybe in the pre-phase where I'm not too familiar with your work, but where you set up a location, for example, or as you said earlier, install a pump. Is there like a set process for doing your due diligence, or is it more qualitative and specific to the given situation?
So normally we do due diligence to support with certain activities. Like I'm talking now NRC, as my program is the Information Counseling and Legal Assistance, where we cover issues on HLP plus other related issues. We have a shelter program within NRC, and of course, before they start with any construction, our program conducts the due diligence before the site is decided on and before any construction takes place. We always try to extend this kind of support to other shelter site management actors, but also through the protection sector or cluster, the HLP working groups. We extend this support to any humanitarian actor that requires due diligence support before any kind of intervention. Thank you. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, it's fine. Thank you. Annonciette, une question pour vous. In your experience in Burundi, particularly in rural areas where customary law may also apply, how can land registration or formalization processes unintentionally disadvantage women or other vulnerable groups? And what signals should practitioners watch out for very early on?
So the system of land registration can have negative impacts on also certain social costs. We'll talk about the lived situation. For example, some women who are not married legally have this problem with the land registration because they're in couples, but they're not legally married. And so the solution that was found by the project was that we could mention on the title that they are co-owners. And so on the other hand, as they lose their right, the legal woman loses her right because this land could be registered to her husband's name. So because the land is occupied by the woman legally and her companion, we have to record the land under both names, even if their union is not legally registered. So, and the other thing is that with regard to land registration, this has caught the attention of indigenous people and vulnerable land people who usually don't have recognized land, because they said that projects were supporting other people who had land for registration, but those who do not have land registered are put to the side because they don't have any land rights to be registered. And so what we advocated for at this moment was that for regional lands that are recognized in the commune, the government could attribute lands to these population, vulnerable people like indigenous people, so that they could have access to land. So this was done to exploit this, respond to this complaint with regards to rights. And another thing is that the people that were living on these lands, which were known as reserve lands, were become weakened because the natural reserve is a public domain recognized by the state and needs to be identified in the name of the state, apart from a case of the disaffectation according to national law. And there was a study that was made during the course of the project to evaluate the change, and it was divided into 3 phases and allowed us to spot the ideas of the communities with regards to stabilizing their rights and with regards to the loss of their rights. And the study was directed towards communities and also towards the authorities, the local authorities and communal authorities. So it allowed us to see changes along the steps of the process. And we did it before the registration of the land. We sampled 6 different hills within the 26 that are present in the commune. And we did it in the same hills during the registration process, and we did it in the same hills after the registration process to measure what was the impact of land certification on these same hills and on these same people who were interviewed. And another thing, the children who saw that their parents were certifying their lands and were being able to have access to micro credits, they started to request from their parents to also have access to these micro credits. And so there was conflict around this. Some households, not all, but some of the parents, when they were alive, the land was managed by the parents, and so the children could only access once the parents passed away. So this created some conflicts, which were maybe silent before these studies took place.
Thank you, Anonset. And so, if I'm not mistaken, Zoa has been working on registration certification of land in the south of Burundi since 2013 or 14, if I'm not mistaken. So it's many years of experience that you have accumulated. And I was wondering whether all these insights about how to protect the rights of married women, formally or not formally married, the rights of widows, the rights of daughters from their biological families or from their own parents, or from vulnerable communities. These were these things that you were aware of from the start, or did you learn over the course of the years how to deal with these things? And if so, then was it possible for you to amend your project in to respond to that?
Yes, there are some situations which were known before the projects, because in 2016 there was in the same community work done on resolution of conflicts and analysis and resolution of conflicts. And so the work had been asked by the provincial administration, because the commune was as a high immigration of people coming from other provinces, and it shares a border with Tanzania and Congo. So there's a lot of movements from neighboring countries, and it's also a commune that was shaken a lot by different crises and the wars that shook Burundi. So there were a lot of repatriates, and so there are complex conflicts between repatriates and residents. And so there are sometimes polygamous couples. They're actually quite not very numerous compared to other communes, because there's a lot of emigration, men leaving to go to Congo, to Tanzania. They leave their wives in the commune and they come back with other wives. And there's also many children left, right, and center. And so people who migrate towards this zone coming from other provinces, sometimes they leave women in other provinces and they find a new five in Nyanza and then make new families. And so there are situations that were discovered before the project. But with regards to situations that were found out during the project, this allowed us flexibility both for the investors and also an adaptation in our project. This was specifically regarding couples, non-married couples, legally non-married couples. We had to adapt to see with other actors who work in land in Burundi, how do we register these lands under whose name? And the formula that was adopted was to class them as co-owners, because the wife illegally married both provided efforts to have this land, and so it should be shared ownership, but which made them women lose rights. Sometimes it made legally married women lose some rights. And
Annunciate, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm being told I'm not managing time well, and I need to leave questions also for the audience to ask. So apologies, but thank you for explaining the richness of the situation. And I understand that you were able to discover some of these issues during the program and to adapt your program to respond to them as you went along. Thank you. Paul, to you, and I'm sorry, so as I said, I need to manage time a bit better. Apologies for that. Can you briefly tell us what kind of instruments the World Bank relies on to ensure that its projects dealing with land, such as titling infrastructure or land acquisition, avoid causing displacement, conflict, or harming local rights? What instruments do you use, and where do you still see challenges, especially in fragile or conflict-affected settings? Over to you.
So the main tool we use is the bank's environment and social framework, which replaced the earlier version of this, which was the bank's environment and social safeguards. So this sets the parameters for how we operate in these situations. And in terms of land, the key one is the environment and social standard number 5. So this deals with physical and economic displacement, whether it's permanent or temporary. And the remedy is to provide compensation at replacement cost. So this is applied to every bank lending operation. So if the bank is lending money or giving a grant to a government, they would have to go through this framework assessment. We have social specialists that would look at the project documents. They would do on the ground identification of areas where there was going to be physical, infrastructure investment to see whether there are people that would be affected or aren't people would not be affected. The problem is that it only covers land acquisition and restrictions on land use, and it's only for bank investments or grant projects. So the scope is actually quite limited. The problem being that, particularly in FCV context, the question is, would this be the best tool to identify where, for example, forced eviction had already taken place beforehand, and then maybe the cadastre was subsequently updated, or like the case of Syria, where we saw large-scale fraudulent land transactions. So the land registry says something, but that's the result of fraud or theft or corruption. So there's a question of can we just step in and build kind of a bubble around our project based on the facts on the ground when the project is being evaluated, and whether that's enough. I mean, the good thing that the ESF did do is it moved us from this kind of do no harm to try to do something positive. So the ESF does have a lot of references, to if there's a case of involuntary resettlement, yes, there should be compensation at replacement costs, but at the same time, are there things you can do to improve people's livelihoods via the project? So at least there's an incentive to try to go beyond just the do no harm. I saw that one colleague, Alex, had already posted a question, so I'll answer that very quickly. So the ESF is not just a one-time assessment. So if the standard is triggered, there would have to be a resettlements plan, and this would be monitored by our social specialists. So if at any time the government's borrowing the money veered from the resettlements plan, the money could be shut off. So that's kind of the monitoring mechanism. I mean, it's not just, we assess the risk and then walk away. The risk will be, if the risk is identified, it will be monitored and evaluated throughout the life of the project. And also we have one colleague in the bank, Mercedes Stickler, who's now also developing some work on de-risking accessibility of land. So one thing that we've heard over and over, for example, for colleagues who do infrastructure projects is, we want to know what land we can invest in, and finding out at the last stage of project development that there's, for example, unclear tenure is the worst time to find out about it. And it's not the time to really do something positive. So there's a bit more emphasis now on kind of proactively identifying where risk would emerge or not emerge, and try to develop this address this in a more comprehensive manner. Thanks.
Okay, and just very quickly, so this monitoring, let's say during implementation, and who in-house would be responsible for that? Is it the same team that manages it? The program or the investment, or is it some external or semi-independent unit?
No, so I mean, at the end of the day, when the bank loans money to a government, it's the government's project, and the government is responsible for implementing it. So they have the full responsibility to follow the resettlements plan, and the bank would monitor whether they're, as part of our regular supervision mechanism for all projects, that would be routinely monitored by the social specialists or the environment specialists within the bank, and they would make a determination about whether, if the government had veered from this. So it's ultimately the government's responsibility. We supervise, we help, we try to guide them and give them advice on how to do things, but ultimately it's their responsibility. But if they violate the responsibility, the money can be turned off.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. And very interesting also that you touched upon the what beyond avoiding harm could we do more positively. Let's see if I manage time well enough. We maybe get to that to the end of the conversation. So back to Jude. Jude, how do humanitarian actors balance time pressure and scale with protection standards when land issues surface late in implementation, especially in highly constrained settings such as where you work?
Hi, Marco. So in emergency settings, time pressures can really undermine protection standards because emergency pushes rapid delivery of services, and sometimes due diligence can be seen as slowing implementation. And this creates tension between the need to deliver services very quickly and do no harm. However, from my experience, skipping due diligence often creates bigger problems later on. Normally, we always advocate for due diligence to be conducted during the design phase, but in reality, many interventions move forward without it, often due to time pressures or operational priorities. And when this happens, land issues tend to surface later in implementation or even after the completion of activities, which affects the services itself, the reputation of the organization. It entails protection risks for the displaced people or the people we're trying to support, and also ultimately wasted resources. I remember a few years back in Burkina Faso, following a sudden displacement, a shelter actor proceeded with site planning and construction of shelters without proper due diligence. And shortly after completion, a person came forward claiming ownership of this plot, which turned out to be true. And this resulted eventually in the deconstruction of all shelters, which eventually delayed the service delivery during the emergency phase and the waste of resources. But when land issues arise later on, either during implementation or afterwards, there are still steps that can be taken. And this includes risk assessment to determine really who controls the land, who might be excluded or harmed, whether evictions, disputes, or informal payments are emerging. And second, it's a shift to dispute resolution. So we utilize mediation or negotiation to facilitate a dialogue between the concerned stakeholders to try and reach an agreement. And the objective of this agreement is regarding use, basically. But the actions that humanitarian actors should be taken should be relevant to the risk level. So for low risk situations such as boundary disputes, maybe monitoring is just enough. But for high risk situations such as imminent threat of eviction, for example, or imminent eviction, this might require rethinking of the whole design of the intervention, or maybe stopping some components until a mitigation plan is in place. I'm going to give another example on this, and I think I'm addressing Joshua's question, or part of Joshua's question from the Q&A with this example. So there was a fire incident in one of the camps in Cox's Bazar, and the shelter and site management actor at that time approached NRC to support with due diligence because, like I mentioned before, due diligence was not really conducted in the Cox's Bazar camps areas when the camps were established. And the assessment revealed that the families concerned or affected by the fire were making rental payments to the landowner because the land was actually a private land located within the camp boundaries. That was given by the government to the humanitarian actors for the response. So if the actor actually proceeded with the reconstruction of the shelters, this would have meant that the families would continue making informal rental payments to the landowner. So we decided to do consultations with the families, with the landowner, camp authorities, and the actor itself. And we decided that maybe, or we agreed that maybe the shelters should not be reconstructed on the original plots. And instead, we would try to find an alternative location for the families to move into, and the actor would construct the shelters there. But in the meantime, we're continuing to advocate with the concerned parties that no refugee should be paying rental or making rental payments if they're living within the designated camp area. But also we're advocating for the government's responsibility to compensate the private landowners whose land fall within the designated camp area for the Rohingya refugees. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm passing over to Annunciat. Annunciat, can we pick up again on what we were discussing during your last answer? So once unintended consequences became clear in your project, what concrete steps did you take to adapt, to mitigate harm or reverse negative effects? And what enabled those corrections to happen within the framework of your project? And I'd be very grateful if you could restrict your answer to the 3 minutes. Sorry.
So for the issues that came up during the implementation, the first action was to revisit conflict cases on state-owned land with a mixed council or mixed team. So we also had public sessions with populations that were living on those hills to clarify their claims, and this was documented. Now, regarding the council leadership, we discussed with the council so that they could consider the claims of these populations that were identified as living on a state-owned land. So the council shared a letter with the ministry to give its stance so that those people should be regularized. Now, regarding the situation of women, some actions were taken, including raising the awareness with a multiple stakeholder approach with women leaders that were taking care of door-to-door awareness campaigns for women to be conscious of their rights to land. Now, regarding vulnerable people, so there's an advocacy work that is being undertaken, and it was decided that some lands were supposed to be allocated to some of this population. So we also had longitudinal studies to have an adaptive programmation. So we were grateful to the donor that was willing to include those activities. So thank you. That's my answer.
Yeah, thank you, Annunciata. I think the last one is also a particularly important point, that obviously the donor frameworks that govern the way that we implement our programs are very important to determine if we can even easily adapt once we have identified that there is harm. So it's good that you point the finger to that. Paul, you mentioned a shift from do no harm to doing something positive. So what would this do no harm plus approach look like in land-related investment? And how does it help build resilience rather than just manage risks?
Thanks. So I mentioned already that the environment and social framework kind of opened the door for the do no harm plus approach, which is kind of the do no harm and try to do something good at the same time. And if it involves some type of land intervention, is there something else that can be done alongside that can help achieve development aims? So, can you at the same time invest in livelihoods of people who have been displaced, invest in their human development, as opposed to just giving them the compensation for having been displaced? So how can you address the other needs that might not be directly caused by the displacement, but at the same time help people achieve their development objectives? I mean, that's kind of the easy answer for it. Also, we're now working on a global study for a policy note on fragile conflict and violence land markets and how resilience can be built into them. And this is funded by the World Bank State and Peacebuilding Trust Fund, which is partially funded by the Dutch government. So thank you, Finance, and our Dutch colleagues for supporting this work. So I think that this is a good example where we're trying to identify areas where if we're involved in land markets, how can we try to proactively build some resilience into it? Keeping in mind that we generally have a good sense of what the impacts are from conflict and violence. I mean, every situation is unique, but we see the same things over and over: land grabbing, fraud, displacement, forced evictions. I mean, we know that these are the risks that are more like going to come. So how can we try to address them in a much more proactive manner? So to give you a very concrete example, we're working with a team in Ukraine now that is investing in housing reconstruction and compensation for damage to housing caused by the conflict there. And one thing we've been advocating is that saying, okay, alongside physical reconstruction, you could be doing cadastre reconstruction. So we know that the cadastre, the land register are not up to date, they're not complete. If people are turning in thousands of documents to apply for compensation and other things, and some of this documentation involves, do you have a utility bill? Do you have a notarized copy of a land sale? And using this to proactively update the cadastre and the land register so that alongside physical reconstruction, you're also reconstructing people's land tenure. I mean, that's one example that we have, but other ones include, how can we increase trust in government via land transactions? So, building capacity to do proper land services. A big one is building responsiveness and accountability in institutions. And I think this is one of the things that I've seen throughout my career of all of the discussion around land and conflict is that, the accountability for having committed these abuses is, I think, one of the big gaps in the way that we've been able to address these type of things. So I think also, accountability goes a long way towards building resilience. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you, Paul. And I was wondering, because this sounds, in a way, it makes me think of discussions that are currently going on around the global gateway strategy of the European Union, which is, of course, also a big investment program. But it's started by what is called a 360 approach, where they say that any investment projects in infrastructure or energy would have to be accompanied first by an analysis and then by supportive measures that ensure that human rights are not trampled upon, that accountability is improved, that the adverse effects that could happen on land are taken account. Is there any dialogue that you're aware of between the bank and the European Union around this?
No, I'm not aware of any dialogue with the EU on this, but I can check and try to find out for you.
We can check. Yes, interesting. Okay.
But there's been a big push in the bank around kind of the due diligence, particularly when it comes to investment in, infrastructure or energy projects that involve that require accessibility to land. So, all things kind of point to you need to do due diligence, but the how to do due diligence is the tricky part.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Jude, I think I'm starting my final round of questions and hope that Neil is still good with my time management. So based on NRC's experience, what is one practical change humanitarian organizations could make tomorrow to better integrate land considerations and truly operationalize a do no harm approach across sectors? So your advice on what we can do in an immediate sense, putting you on the spot.
I will keep my answer brief. So the most common issue we have observed, and as I tried to convey in the examples I presented today, is that due diligence is rarely being conducted. So my main request really is to mandate due diligence process before any activity that touches on land or property. And this is in fact across all sectors. And I would also request that land-related risks are integrated in the project risk matrices, because we normally see project matrices that include government policies, decreased funding, community acceptance, climate shocks, etc., but nothing really on land or access to land. So the teams should be able to document risks and mitigation measures in line with the context where they operate, with gender and displacement considerations, including original use rights holder, and consider referrals to legal protection actors if risks are flagged. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think it's the pointing to the risk matrices is very important, because I think my experience over the years have been that even if we draw up risk matrices at the start, we're not always as diligent in actually keeping an eye on them throughout the subsequent period of implementation, and that's really an important monitoring tool to make use of quite a bit more. And on that similar question for you. So looking back, what is the one lesson from Zoa's experience in the south of Burundi that other land governance programs should take seriously if they want to avoid repeating similar mistakes as you have seen?
The first is the flexibility of the donor for an adaptive programmation. So we should also have a longitudinal study that will help capture the signals of the unexpected consequences of the different phases of the implementation. Thirdly, we have to raise the awareness during the project, because at certain point we had some awareness campaigns at the beginning of the project, but before the certification of the land, it stopped. So from start to the end point, we should raise the awareness of the community. We should also capitalize on what we live in the land tenure sector, because there are so many consequences. We should try and reconcile customary laws and administration and laws, because we know that the base of the land tenure is the community dialogue. We also have cultural barriers between women and men that should be tackled. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And then finally, Paul, again, a similar question for you. What would you identify as the most important institutional or policy change that is needed across donors, governments, or implementers to better manage land-related risks over the long term?
I mean, to put it very simply, I think for all involved, there needs to be an acceptance and a willingness to have difficult policy discussions with a long-term view. You know, my colleague Yvonne Moreno, who may or may not be connected, as an example, we were often called in by governments to say, hey, we want to do a land restitution process. You two have been involved in these before. You know, what do you think? And we'd say, okay, like, here's the 10 questions you need to ask yourself before you even consider doing something like this. And it's a lot of difficult policy that needs to have a decision on, and then they kind of shy away from it. So that would be the quick answer. But I also want to recognize that Deborah Oyogo, she wrote a really beautiful paragraph in the Q&A, which I think says all of this, you know, what's missing from this, from my view, very beautifully and perfectly.
Okay, I'm not sure if we can find that. Well, I invite everyone to look at it. I'm handling so many screens that I can't find it at the moment myself. But thank you, thanks Paul, and thanks everyone, the panelists for bearing with me and for all your answers. We've been getting loads of questions. I'm informed. So I have a first one from Edson Dornelles de Andrade, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who indicates the biggest problem indigenous peoples have with courts is trust. What power do communities have when the government and big corporations are aligned to build a road, a dam, etc.? When they insist on criminalization, intimidation, weak enforcement, slow, very slow court decisions, what leverages do communities have? I'm not sure if this is, I don't think this is a question posed to any specific panelist, but whomever of you feels addressed, please go ahead.
I mean, I can just say very briefly, I mean, I think that this is very much a problem of poor governance, which stretches into land governance, but doesn't only include the land sector. And because it takes a long time to build proper governance, whether it's, checks and balances and accountability. This is something that's not easy to be done. It's not something that can really be done quickly, and it certainly can't be done through these kind of 5-year projects that development partners tend to have. Also a problem is, I mean, not the problem, but the reality with the bank is, the bank's modus operandi is that we work primarily through government. And this is based on the assumption that government has the best interests of their citizens when requesting loans and implementing projects. I mean, the default is, you really need to have some accountability through your government institutions. I don't think that this is something, I mean, development organizations can try to enhance this, but it can't replace what should be governance by their own governments.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to do so as a moderator, but the question appeals to me also. I mean, as a rule of law organization, we often work alongside land programs. And for example, if you think of land registration projects, the question is about investments, of course. But if you think about land registration, we often wonder, so what's the sense of investing so much money in certifying thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands or millions of plots of land and giving people ownership certificates if courts are corrupt, are unaware of the new system, and if the rate of enforcement of court decisions is extremely low in a context like that, no? So how much legal certainty can you expect to create or improve in those kind of settings? So I agree. It's as we said before, not something to be done in isolation, and really things to be analyzed from a broad governance and rule of law perspective. So unless I have other panelists who wish to respond, I have a second question from Alex Maurtua Constantinidi. Again, hoping I'm pronouncing that best. Addressed to Paul. When the World Bank has already made the initial investment on a project and the local government did not follow ESS 5 to displace people, resulting in displacement with no compensation and no data collection for baseline, what's the bank position around this? Would the bank put the investment on hold? Who pays for the mitigation of the livelihood impacts not accounted for in the original project?
Yes, I alluded to this question in my answer before, but the quick answer is, ESF 5 sets off a series of steps that need to be taken throughout the project. So if it is triggered, there would need to be a resettlements plan, and this resettlement plan would be monitored by the bank, by our social and environment specialists, to make sure that what was agreed in the resettlement plan is carried out. And if it's not carried out, if the government veers from it, then the project can be stopped and the funds can be stopped. Or at least that activity would be stopped.
Thanks. And I have a third question, which is more on the humanitarian side of things. It's a question from Ojungo Joshua. In situations where settlement expansion triggers intra-host disputes, particularly around compensation and land allocation to refugees, what practical approaches should humanitarian and government actors adopt to manage these disputes, maintain community cohesion, and avoid creating long-term land grievances? Jude, I think this one is for you.
We see the situations in a lot of contexts where, especially in cases of protracted displacement, where refugees are within the same camp area, over the years they grow in numbers, they need more space. And Exhibit 1 is here in Bangladesh, where it either resulted in first lack of space for refugees, so some of them are actually getting outside of the camp and renting properties outside, which is seen as an unauthorized activity by the government, or it's governments who expand the camp boundaries to include more land, which normally belong to host community members. And as I mentioned when I addressed I believe the third question, it's really, there's so much really we can do beside first facilitating dialogue between the communities and also working with the government. And if they're not receptive, of course, through advocacy to donors and with the government directly on establishing compensation mechanisms for those whose lands fall within the camp boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude. So I have a question from an anonymous participant, which I think maybe Annonciat, you might help address. So what are broadly speaking the lessons, and do you have any concrete examples around customary land ownership and certification, especially when there is a clash between customary land tenure systems and formal land tenure systems?
There is not an example for the customary land registration, because in Burundi we have two levels of land registration. The first one is communal level, and the second one is the national level. And so most of the land, customary land, is registered at the level of communitary. And so the communities declare that there is no conflict on the land and that the land belongs to whoever asks for the request. So we request that the communities and the people that are elected by the local population, so that they corroborate or validate the recognition of the land. But at the national level, there is now no formality. Oh, there is more regulation and legislation. So there's a long process and it's very costly. And the government judged that they should have a proximity registration, which is assured by at the community level. This is why we have two levels of registration.
Thank you very much. So we're going to start to wrap up. So thanks to the audience for all these great questions. I would want to ask each panelist to say in 1 sentence, 1 minute, what is the single message you would want the audience and practitioners in general to take away from this webinar about do no harm in contexts that involve land? Jude, you're first.
Thanks. So I'm going back to my last point on the importance of due diligence and the fact that a lot of organizations try to avoid it or decide to avoid it. And it's not being conducted consistently. So, and this step is not just a bureaucracy, because it's protecting the communities, it's protecting the rights holders, the partners, and the integrity of our work as humanitarian or development actors. And if we get this right, everything else becomes effective, because due diligence in a lot of ways really bridges humanitarian action into durable solutions. Because to achieve sustainable outcomes for the people we serve, they should be built on do no harm, trust, accountability, and responsible decision making. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude. Annunziata, over to you. Your 1 minute pitch and final message.
So as a message, I would say it's to evaluate, do analysis before the implementation of the project, to measure progressively the conflict and minimize the negative impacts, and also maximize the positive impacts of the conflicts during the process, and also to monitor the signs. Thank you.
Right, thanks. Paul, your key takeaway for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I would say due diligence is not kind of a one-off checklist kind of exercise. You need to think in the longer term. What due diligence means and requires needs to be evaluated and reevaluated over time. And I think also that any opportunity we have to build land resilience into humanitarian or development projects, whether they're lands projects or infrastructure or anything else, that opportunity needs to be taken advantage of, and we need to learn to communicate the importance of this beyond, land specialist and the land silo, because there's a lot of competition for development money, and you need to explain why this is important.
Great, thanks to you also, Juan. Thanks everyone for joining us here today. I hope you have found it an interesting discussion. Personally, I think we came very far. There's one question sort of singing through my mind is around the practicality of creating feedback loops in our program. So how do we create easily accessible avenues for those who are affected communities, landholders, justice seekers, to access information, to hold to account without creating too complex grievance mechanisms? Perhaps that's something that can be looked at in a next iteration of the webinars. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you all, and I'm wishing you a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.